Hello and welcome. Today we are going to learn all about buttons in Android. So when we develop Android app, the buttons are the most underrated components because without buttons, we can't create user interactions in the Android app. So in this video, we are going to talk about all about buttons in Android app development. So we will be exploring what are the buttons, what are the types of button, where and where not to use buttons, and how to select right placement for the buttons. So I will be referring Google's official website and documentation while explaining the buttons. Let's look at the types of buttons. So there are many types of buttons in Android, as you can see. For example, there is default button, toggle button, icon button, and floating action button, and etc. But everything comes down to only 4 types of button in Android. The rest are just subtypes of button. There are only 4 types of button. One is the normal button, icon button, and also known as floating action bar. So these are the normal buttons which you can see, and number 3 and number 4 are the icon buttons. On the 4 number it's just a toggle icon button, but number 3 is the actual icon button. And then there is a floating action button, number 8 and number 9. Number 8 is classical floating action button in Android. Now the important question is how to choose the right button and how to choose the right placement. So for this there are only 2 things you need to understand for the button. It is the emphasis of button and the placement of the button. Emphasis of button and the placement of button, these two are very important points you need to understand before implementing the buttons. The emphasis of button is generally showed via the color. The vivid, bright, primary or light tonal color represent various emphasis of the button. Let's look at an example. The buttons on higher emphasis means which are highly important, and button with lower emphasis means buttons which are less important, and the medium ones are the medium. So the higher emphasis button will have deep or vibrant color, medium will have slightly tonal whitish color, and the low emphasis button will always have pure white color and maybe sometimes a border. So that's how emphasis of button is recognized. And as you can see, there are many emphasis of button which we can see in the example. Now let's understand how to place button and which emphasis to use. So let's take an example. This is the example which I have taken from Google's own official documentation website of Material 3. As you can see in this example, the add entry button is a floating action button, and the view entry button is a normal button, and a related article button, which is number 2, is a text button. So the way the emphasis work is the most important button is kept with a higher emphasis, and it is kept on the top of the UI layer. That's why floating action button is used, because floating action button generally represent a higher importance in UI hierarchy, whereas the medium emphasis or the medium important is represented here with a normal button which is view entry, and the least important button which is related articles, it is only text button to show it is less important and less emphasis. So that's how you have to select and place the button based on its important and the emphasis level. High emphasis and high important button will be on the top of the UI hierarchy, example floating action button, and the normal emphasis will be mostly simple button, and the less emphasis will be sometimes the text button. Now let's look at the code of the buttons and how to implement these buttons in your Android app. So here is the code of buttons which I have already wrote to simplify the stuff. Each and every button has its own style. For example, the default button has a fill button which is simple, a color button and a white color text, and here is a code for it. It is very simple. Just add Jetpack Compose function of your button, add the property of on click in which you can execute your on click event or function, and then add modifiers such as padding, etc. And inside this button add text widget of your Jetpack Compose and mention the text of the button. This is a very simple code for writing any button, and this will always create the default style which is fill button. And in case if you want to change the style, you can always add a elevated button, fill tone button or outline button, Jetpack Compose, and the rest remains almost the same. Now this is the code for a very simple buttons. In case if you want to add icon in your button, then you can add icon in your button by mentioning the icon widget and add little bit spacer in between the text and the icon inside the button function, and then you will have an icon button. in which there will be an icon as well as text, and rest you can modify as you wish, and most of the things are same, such as on click event, modifiers, etc, etc. Now next type of button is the icon button. Previously we saw a simple button with a simple icon, which are generally the simple buttons, but now we will look at the icon button. So basically the icon buttons are the buttons which only contain a icon, or you can call it image. There are multiple types of icon buttons, such as toggle icon, icon button, and filled icon button, and filled tonal icon button, like this. But everything is almost same. All you have to understand is the simple icon button works like this. You have to add icon button Jetpack Compose widget. Inside it mention on click event, and inside it add Jetpack Compose icon, and then there you have it, a simple icon button. And the simple icon button, this is how it will look like. In case if you want to add color and make it fancy, then you can use the filled icon button. This is how filled icon button will look like. There will be a circle, and inside it there will be an icon, white color icon, and same is with the tonal icon. Now let's look at the fab icon. Fab stands for floating action button. Generally the fab icons represent extremely important tasks, such as creating email, adding new entries, etc, etc. But fab icons shows very high importance in your UI hierarchy, and also it has higher emphasis as compared to other UI element, because floating action button floats on top of the UI element. As you can see, there is a shadow underneath the button, because floating action button generally floats on top of the UI element, and hence called as a floating action button. And remember, floating action button always and always used for very important actions with higher emphasis, or very important UI events. So code for floating action button is very easy. Just add Jetpack Compose function of floating action button, and as usual add click event and modifier, and inside it add an icon, and that's it. All you have to do is simply add this function and your floating action button is ready. So it's fairly simple and easy. That's how all these three buttons are implemented. Simple button, icon button, and floating action button. These three are the only important button which you need to know as a beginner, and rest of the other buttons, these are just subtypes of these buttons. With that said, we have reached to the end of the video, and in case if you need a full-blown tutorial, comment down below, because I have kept this video extremely short and simple for easy to understand. Have a nice day, and bye bye. See you in the next video.